お待たせいたしました。ただいまより自然エネルギー財団主催。
Thank you very much for waiting, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to start REI, Renewable Energy Institute International Symposium Revision 2023, Overcoming the Energy Crisis with Renewables. First, the President, Thomas Coverrier of Renewable Energy Institute, will make an opening remark.
Good morning to all of you in the room and to all of you who are watching this conference via the web. It is really great to be able to welcome you to a physical meeting after years of screen-based conferences trying to create an atmosphere similar to the real physical meetings. I belong to those who prefer meeting people in real life. We have not only suffered a coronavirus pandemic, changing the way we live and the way we interact in the world. In the last year, we have also seen one of the worst global energy cost crisis that we have experienced for the last decades. In Europe, we had some initial difficulties understanding what really changed in the electricity system. But now, with all the numbers being available after the last year, we can see that there were two major disruptions changing the European supply last year. The first one, the biggest one, was a large decrease in nuclear electricity production. It was to the largest part unintended, unwanted, and unplanned. And it occurred in France, the country in the world with the highest share of nuclear electricity generation. The electricity production from nuclear in France decreased from 2021 to 2022 by more than 80 terawatt hours. That turned France from being the world's largest net exporter of electricity in 2021 to being a net importer in 2022. In addition to this illustration of the not always reliable nuclear power risks, we also faced extreme weather in southern Europe last year. Extreme heat and very little precipitation in southern Europe decreased hydroelectric generation by 60 terawatt hours. Countries like Austria, Switzerland, France, Italy had an unplanned, unwanted decrease in electricity supply because of this extreme weather. Both these effects seem to continue into 2023. The nuclear reactors in France have produced less so far this year than the year before. Hydropower in France and Italy likewise less supplying electricity than 1 year ago. This created a great change in the electricity supply, and to compensate for the lack of nuclear power and hydropower, Europe had to increase its production of electricity from fossil fuels. And this was not so easy in a year when the Russian invasion in the Ukraine had created a conflict with Russia, and Europe, traditionally importing most of its fossil fuel from Russia, did not want to support the Russian economy by buying Russian fossil fuels. So Europe had to find other sources of fossil fuels, and that made the fossil fuels more expensive. In particular, there was a shift from using fossil gas to using coal, which also increased the carbon dioxide emissions and made the emission trading in Europe see record high prices on carbon dioxide emissions, and as a result, very high electricity prices. Some people try to blame this on progressive green energy policies. Vladimir Putin himself claimed that the prices in Europe was due to the green policies. And this is utterly wrong. It has been contradicted several times by Fatih Birol of the IEA and many energy companies and political leaders in Europe. That is nonsense. And one good illustration of how important it has been to be successful in developing new renewable electricity generation is that the new renewables actually managed to substitute quite a lot of the lost nuclear and hydro production last year with very high increases in solar electricity generation and wind power generation in Europe. Germany, that actually did deliberately and planned closure of nuclear reactors by the end of 2021, during 2022, when France failed to produce electricity in an unplanned way, managed to substitute much of the French lost electricity generation by increasing its exports to France. Sweden, likewise a country where nuclear reactors have been closed in an economic, rational way decided by the power companies, and at the same time seen a dramatic increase in wind power generation. Sweden became the largest net exporter of electricity in Europe last year, and Germany was number 2. Britain, where some nuclear reactors were closed last year officially, owned by the French EDF, has also seen a remarkable increase in wind power generation over the last few years, and have also turned from being one of Europe's net importers of electricity to actually being a net exporter, in particular to France, but surprisingly to some, also in the third quarter, a net exporter to Norway, which few people had predicted. So the lessons from Europe from last year is that it is dangerous to be dependent on nuclear power. Nuclear power is not as predictable, plannable as some people claim. We've learned that extreme weather events, that's something that we do expect to happen more often if the climate change scientists are right, is something that may directly affect electricity generation and cause new problems, not only the traditionally described problems of climate change. Thirdly, being dependent on imported fossil fuels in a time of global conflict is not so comfortable. All these lessons that we have learned in Europe during last year are very relevant also in the Japanese and Asian context. The solution, as seen in Europe, is successful development of low-cost renewable electricity production, and not least, improved energy efficiency, ensuring that all the technological opportunities to get what you want in terms of energy services at minimal cost, using technologies in a clever way rather than just using more electricity or other sources of energy. So last year taught us lessons globally, and we have a continuous development of the solutions in the forms of energy efficiency and renewable electricity. And we will hear more about these opportunities during the day today. And we will definitely hear a bit about them already in the first video lecture, the keynote presentation that will be delivered by Amory Lovins, the founder and chairman emeritus of Rocky Mountain Institute. So I hope we will get him on the screen in real time, but at a long distance now. Welcome, Amory.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we do.
And do you see my slides?
Not yet.
Huh. Well, that's interesting.
Now they're coming. We see your
Yeah,
Rocky Mountain Institute logotype.
Okay, good. Ohel gozaimasu, Robert Emeritus. Thank you for the honor of summarizing some electricity surprises in which Japan could lead or follow. They involve efficient electricity use, renewable and distributed supply, grid integration, and choosing the best and cheapest portfolio of options. In the past 46 years, saved energy, about 2/3 due to smarter technologies, has dropped US energy use per dollar of GDP by 61%. Renewables, meanwhile, doubled, but with 28 times less cumulative impact. The ratio of headlines and awareness is the opposite, because renewables are visible while energy is invisible, and the energy you don't use is almost unimaginable. Yet saved energy is half of the world's historic decarbonization and at least half of future decarbonization. Here's a progress report. Around 1975, US government and industry all said that primary energy productivity, the GDP produced per unit of primary energy used, could never rise. A year later, I heretically suggested it could rise 257% in 50 years. So far, it's risen 156% in 46 years. Yet, just the innovations already added by 2010 can raise energy productivity by another threefold, twice what I originally thought, at a third the real cost. And today that looks conservative, because optimizing buildings, vehicles, and factories as whole systems, not as piles of parts, can often make very big energy savings cost less than small or no savings, turning diminishing returns into increasing returns. This is true even in Japan, where efficiency has lagged a bit. Many industries are very efficient, but not yet in every way. And by international standards, road vehicles are rather inefficient, and most buildings are very inefficient. So Japan still has much energy muri and mura to eliminate through Kaizen. Among these examples I've shown you before, illustrating rapid progress in building design, let me highlight the lower middle photograph, Takanaka's retrofit of its Higashikanto office, saving 72% of its energy use without interrupting occupancy. Today's best designs and technologies can save even more but cost less. Indeed, it now appears possible to keep people comfortable in the shade, even in the heat and humidity of Singapore, without using any air conditioning or electricity, but only radiative cooling, passively rejecting heat to the sky. Using super windows in muggy India, Rohan Parikh's team built 1.5 million square meters of offices that use 80% less energy than normal, with 10 or 20% lower construction cost, yet superior comfort and satisfaction. Glare-free lighting is delivered throughout by contract. If workers complain of glare and demand blinds, then the architect doesn't get paid. Here are two graphs that IPCC reported 9 years ago, with bigger savings to the right and lower costs toward the bottom. Among European new buildings on the left and retrofit buildings on the right, the best projects saved up to at least 90% of their energy without raising the cost of saved energy. Many projects did cost far more by not adopting the best practices shown, and the difference is a business opportunity. Japan's potential, I believe, is similar or greater. Japan has some wonderfully efficient home appliances, but these two Swiss examples are several-fold better still. A fist-size heat pump that can deliver 6 to 15 units of hot water per unit of electricity, and an electric cooking system using vacuum-insulated pots and with a teppanyaki option. The conduction cooking system here cooks 2 to 4.5 times more efficiently than a modern induction system. Industry uses half the world's energy and electricity. My team's latest $60-odd billion worth of industrial redesigns typically found about 30 to 60% energy savings on retrofit, paying back in a few years, and far outperforming the brown zone in the upper left, where most energy service companies deliver disintegrated design. Our new build projects generally found about 40 to 90+% savings with lower than normal capital cost. Such results seem rare but look feasible in Japan also. Just better pipe and duct design, saving 80 to 90% of friction and therefore pumping power, could, if fully deployed, save roughly half the world's coal-fired electricity, with paybacks typically under 1 year in retrofit and instant in new build. But this isn't yet in any standard engineering textbook, government study, industry forecast, or climate model. Why not? Because it's not a technology. It's a design method, and few people yet think of design as a way to scale big savings. To wring out friction, we simply use big pipes and small pumps, not small pipes and big pumps. And to eliminate elbows and their friction, we lay out the pipes first, then the equipment, laying out supply pipes as if they were drains. We bend minds, not pipes. Japan is not yet teaching or applying such integrative design, a proven method described in this paper. Making energy savings several-fold bigger can actually cost less because it uses not more but fewer devices and not fancier but simpler devices, more artfully chosen, combined, timed, and sequenced. Familiar resources like metal ore bodies and oil reservoirs are finite and depletable assemblages of atoms, but energy efficiency resources are infinitely expandable assemblages of ideas, depleting only stupidity, a very abundant resource. Fully applying practical, profitable, and proven integrative design methods could make the global economy about 5 times more energy efficient over the next few decades. Much of this potential applies also to Japan, which has the capacity to lead this transformation if it can summon the will. 12 years ago, 60 colleagues and I described in the business book Reinventing Fire how to triple U.S. energy efficiency and quintuple renewable supplies by 2050, reaching a 2-degree climate target $5 trillion cheaper, all led by business for profit. The first 11 years of that 40-year journey are pretty well on track, green actual versus blue proposed, I think largely because the private sector smells the $5 trillion on the table. That's exactly what should be happening. But our assessment proved conservative, understating or omitting important climate change mitigations. We showed, for example, how by 2050, at a historically reasonable pace, very profitably tripled or quadrupled energy efficiency in U.S. buildings, which use 3/4 of electricity, and doubled energy efficiency in industry, could shrink electricity use 25%, despite all electric autos and a 2.6 times bigger GDP. This quadrupled electric efficiency would cost 1/10 as much as the electricity it saves. I see no reason to suppose these potential savings are much smaller in Japan. And by the way, we didn't count a lot of the integrative design potential. And we should not need several-fold more electricity to decarbonize transport and industry. Just better structural design can save about half the world's cement and steel, and low-temperature ways to make such materials are rapidly emerging. Meanwhile, in virtually all industrial countries except Japan and Russia, electric supply is rapidly switching from fossil and nuclear energy to renewables. Because their prices are stable and several-fold lower, they can be made domestically, and they build true energy security and resilience. In countries with over 2/3 of the world's people and 90% of the world's power generation, unsubsidized renewables, solar in yellow, wind in blue, are now the cheapest source of new bulk electricity. In about half the world, they beat just the operating costs of existing coal and gas units. Moreover, the cheapest way to meet a flat or constant load is now variable renewables plus backup, which can be storage or renewable or fueled, not traditional thermal power stations. These findings are strengthening every year because renewables and batteries keep trending cheaper while coal, gas, and nuclear plants get costlier. Putin's war has greatly strengthened renewables' advantages in cost and security. Our energy systems are also under constant threat from squirrels, wild weather, war, earthquakes, typhoons, and the solar flares that will sooner or later destroy any unprotected power grid, as most still are. The next solar storm peak, due in about 2 years, is expected to be one of the most intense yet observed. These are not rare events. Unprotected power grids are living on borrowed time. But against all these threats and more, our best protection is a portfolio of efficiently used, diverse, dispersed, renewable, resilient power sources, the right size for the task. The most valuable sources are on our roofs, not at the other end of a vast and brittle grid, and they're wired to work with or without the grid. That should be our standard practice. Now, Japan's rooftop solar has cost less than grid power since 2014, but utility-scale solar and wind power still cost about twice world norms. In 2020 alone, China added nearly twice as much solar and wind capacity as Japan had ever built cumulatively. If Japan's utilities keep burning so much fossil fuel, Japanese companies will not be eligible to compete for global business, where supply chains require decarbonization. But real competition, unleashing Japan's immense industrial and innovative power, could make clean and secure electricity abundant and affordable. The main obstacle is central government policies that help incumbent utilities to stifle competition to protect their legacy assets. This makes Japan's electricity costlier and less resilient, and the whole economy less competitive. Even restarting old nuclear plants, let alone building more, probably worsens climate change because it costs more and therefore saves less carbon per yen than investing in efficiency or renewables instead. Here's the global renewable revolution that is leaving Japan somewhat behind. The blue curve, modern renewables, that is all kinds except big hydro dams, grew faster in the past decade than the magenta nuclear curve's fastest growth historically, which was back in the 1980s. Total renewables are about 90 or 95% of all net increases in global capacity. They now produce 3 times nuclear power's output. They've surpassed gas-fired generation. They will soon surpass coal-fired generation, and they continue to accelerate. Modern renewables' first trillion watts in 2016 took about 15 years to build. The next trillion watts took 5 years and cost about half as much. Most of those renewables made and nearly half bought by China. The next trillion watts will take less than 3 years. The International Energy Agency's China forecast a year and a half ago rose by nearly 70% in 1 year. It now shows 85% growth in the next few years, adding almost 800 gigawatts. And the world's installed nuclear capacity is now about 50 times what IEA forecast in 2002. In 2028, sooner than you could build a typical nuclear plant, Bloomberg predicts solar electricity alone will exceed the global nuclear generation of 3 years ago. At the same time, Bloomberg forecasts the median power plant size in Europe will fall 20-fold, that Europe's fraction of generation directly injected into the distribution grid will rise from 24% to 67%, and that global median unit size of power plants will fall 6-fold. This huge shift implies far more omnidirectional power flows in more richly interconnected and perhaps lower voltage grids or webs with new modes of control. And this is partly because of economics. Small is not only resilient but also profitable, thanks to 207 economic benefits of being the right size for the task. These long overlooked benefits typically increase value by about 10-fold, overwhelming the cost differences seen in competitive markets. This was documented in a big book some of us did 21 years ago. It's also in Japanese, combining financial economics with electrical engineering. Its logic is proving very advantageous where competition is allowed, and it applies also in efficient use and in other kinds of infrastructure. So an instructive model could be prosperous Denmark, now roughly 4/5 renewably powered, soon 100%. Denmark has nearly completed its journey from centralized power stations in red on the left to distributed wind turbines in blue and mostly farm waste cogeneration in brown on the right. Central electricity-only stations' 1980 output by 7 years ago was 99.9% gone. They didn't need it anymore. While GDP grew 72%, Denmark used 24% less electricity. They used it more than twice as efficiently. They cut its carbon intensity by 64% in 12 years, while renewable output rose more than 10 times. Profits, reliability, and resilience all improved. Denmark is headed for all renewable total energy by 2050, and they're experimenting with resilient so-called cellular grid architectures that keep the lights on even if the power lines go down. Japan could do all the same things, illustrating how quadrupling renewable share is making Germany's electric service more reliable. The white curve shows a standard metric for outages, fluctuating with storms but trending broadly downwards. And similarly in Texas, where installed wind power in red tripled in 6 years, while the reserves needed to cover wind shortfalls in blue fell by about half. And my latest update confirms that these trends have continued. Now, this transition is manageable because we have not just one way, bulk storage in magenta, but about 10 carbon-free ways to make the grid flexible, reliable, and resilient as it becomes renewable. They're sketched here in approximate order of increasing cost. Your actual costs will vary, but bulk storage on the right comes last, not first. So we need not wait for a storage miracle, though some are emerging, and the market isn't waiting. The two boxes at the far left are both several-fold larger than we thought a few years ago. More than 3/4 of today's use could be profitably saved if we competed or compared efficient use against supply. Separately, using electricity timely can cut peak load by more than half. And integrating electric cars with the grid, the box just to the left of the dark red one, could be very important too, because it's easier to solve the car and electricity problems together than separately. In Amsterdam, you can drive your electric car to the world's greenest football stadium, plug it in to help power the stadium while keeping enough charge to drive home, and get in for free. Many Nissan Leaf battery packs, 2/5 of them reincarnated in a second life, also provide valuable services to the grid. A Swiss firm called the Mobility House worked with Daimler, Audi, and Renault to integrate auto batteries with the grid in Holland, France, and Germany. It provides 13 of the 21 services offered by automotive grid integration, such as selling frequency stability to the German grid, with a car licensed as a power plant. The firm expects that by 2025, a smart bidirectionally charging electric car should generate an annual operating profit of 83,000 yen. 2 years ago, the firm was earning 125,000 yen per auto battery per year by managing thousands of EVs and their battery packs. Now, we are often told that we need fossil and nuclear plants to keep the lights on because wind and solar are variable and thus supposedly unreliable. But variable does not mean unpredictable. Here's how accurately the French grid operator in a stormy winter month forecast a day ahead the actual output of the country's wind farms. I'll bet they wish they could forecast demand that accurately. And now, a decade later, East Danish wind operators can bid wind power into the day-ahead hourly auctions, just like fossil-fueled capacity, because today's accurate wind forecasting makes the operators more confident they can deliver timely on their contract than the grid operators are confident that when they push the start button on a gas turbine, it will actually start. Indeed, we built the grid because no generator is 24/7. They all break. And when a giant power plant fails, you lose 1 billion watts in milliseconds, often abruptly, for weeks or months. Grids manage this intermittence by backing up failed plants with working plants. And in exactly the same way, but often at lower cost, the grid can manage the forecastable variations of solar and wind power by backing up those variable renewables with a portfolio of other renewables, all forecasted, integrated, and diversified by type and by location. So in the big, hot, and often humid state of Texas, whose grid has no big hydro dams and is not connected to the rest of the United States, the varying loads forecast for a summer week in 2050 can get smaller and less peaky with profitably efficient use, but still they need over 30 peak gigawatts. So now let's make that electricity 86% from wind and photovoltaics, with 14% from other dispatchable renewables like geothermal, small hydro, solar thermal electric, and burning biogas and municipal and industrial wastes and obsolete energy studies. The resulting diversified all-renewable supply then leaves surpluses to charge ice storage air conditioners and smart electric automobiles. Then recovering that distributed storage when needed and filling the last gaps with unobtrusively flexible demand yields 100% renewable electricity every hour of the year with no bulk storage and with only 5% left over to decarbonize other sectors. So the economics would be excellent even at today's prices. In contrast, Japan's electricity policy rests on an obsolete assumption that big and relatively steady power plants like coal and nuclear are needed for reliability. In fact, they actually no longer have an operational need or a business case. As competitive economies retire those big and inflexible thermal plants, their antique honorific term baseload is best retired too, because it no longer reflects how modern grids actually work. Some grid operators now do this renewable choreography every day, often at levels that some in the Japanese government think are impossible. Germany, Britain, and Ireland are half renewably powered. Denmark expects to be 86% renewably powered around now, even a couple of years ago. Scotland about 100%, they hit 99 recently. Already they and some other European countries with modest or no hydropower meet about half to three-fourths or more of their annual electricity needs from renewables without adding bulk storage, and they have superior reliability. The 99.999% reliable former East German utility, 50 Hertz, was 62% renewably powered 2 years ago. They target 100% reliably integrated in another 9 years. So, as my colleague Clay Stranger says, the operators have learned to run these grids the way the conductor leads the Tokyo Symphony. No instrument plays all the time, but the ensemble continuously makes beautiful music. Now, the same ultra-reliable German grid operator just analyzed Europe's long, calm, cloudy periods. These do need backup power, but for only up to 1 or 2 weeks a year, totaling about 6% of winter electricity use, using just existing gas-fired capacity, burning green molecules like hydrogen or ammonia made at other times from surplus solar and wind power. The often claimed need for months or seasons of storage was not found, partly because this study included efficient use, electric vehicle integration, heat pumps, behind-the-meter home batteries, and demand response that by itself could cut renewable powers over or under supply days by 90%. Likewise, the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory competed efficiency against storage. They conservatively found that making U.S. buildings more efficient can reduce investments by roughly tenfold, by about 97% in the region with a Japan-like climate, by displacing long-duration hydrogen storage and green electricity to make it. Of course, decarbonization comes from clean supply plus efficient use. Germany, the world's #4 economy, powerfully illustrates their combined effect. Contrary to a widespread myth, despite the German nuclear phase-out agreed 2 decades earlier, fossil fuel generation rapidly declined at the same time. On the left, 30 years of German history shows robust economic growth entirely offset by more efficient use in gold, and that caused coal and lignite generation in black and brown on the right to fall. And this is despite the closure of most nuclear plants in and after 2011, with the last ones due to close at the end of last year, just postponed a few months to cover for the huge underperformance Thomas mentioned in the French nuclear fleet. And now Germany is greatly accelerating both efficiency and renewables to save more carbon and money even sooner. What the IEA calls the cheapest bulk power source on Earth, photovoltaics, is still often misanalyzed, though. The left graph's violin plots show that even the IPCC's 2018 climate report relied mainly on old predictions of low solar output. But the 2 red bars in that left chart predict about 3 to 10 times more solar by letting observed learning curves, lower price with higher volume, actually operate within the models. The second graph shows that photovoltaics since 1976 had a 23% learning curve, as most models still assume, but in the past 15 years that jumped to 40%. The third graph shows that many integrated assessment models assume solar power will cost more in 2050 than it did cost in 2019, and that around that time they cost up to about 6 times their actual market price. And the fourth graph shows how using solar power's actual market prices and behaviors predicts nearly 100% renewable electricity by 2050, yet climate policy still relies mainly on the gray theoretical models. Here's a similar view from an important Oxford study. In the first graph, real energy costs for the past 140 years have long been about flat for fossil fuels, then for nuclear energy, but steeply declining for major renewables, driving their rapid growth in the second graph. Yet virtually the entire literature used in climate policy is unmoored from the actual prices in the marketplace. So the third graph's inset histogram shows that nearly 3,000 integrated assessment model runs predicted that solar power costs from 2010 to 2020 would fall by an average of 2.6% a year. The most optimistic said under 6%. The actual was 15% a year. The most optimistic renewable forecasts in those models, or the IEA's model, are shown as the downward sloping colored lines in the third graph. And they assumed far slower cost drops, therefore far less solar growth in the decisive next decade. Indeed, the fourth graph shows how diverse models further assumed that solar costs could not fall below certain floor levels, the green lines, which actual prices cheerfully blasted right through one after another. And yet these models from economic theory, not engineering practice, continue today to drive global climate policy and hence climate reality. And my last detailed slide here, the Oxford team sought to shake up those obsolete perceptions by using actual market data in a deliberately simple, transparent way. And they looked at 3 global energy scenarios for the energy transition in 9 graphs. From left to right, the 3 columns show a fast transition that gets the world off fossil fuels by about 2040, a slow transition, or like Japan, that rapidly suppresses renewable growth so fossil fuels still dominate by mid-century, and a worst-case no transition scenario, the right column, that simply scales current market shares. And then going across, the top row of graphs shows energy services delivered or useful energy. The middle row shows final energy. The bottom row shows, in light aqua, the electricity used in currently electrified sectors. In dark aqua, the electricity that makes green fuels to back up the grid. And in dark blue, the electricity making green fuels for heavy transport and industrial heat. And the dashed magenta curve shows storage capacity enough to run the grid for a month with no renewable input, far more storage than needed. Importantly, no scenario includes any faster energy or materials efficiency, which would of course reduce supply at its costs. But nonetheless, the fast transition turned out to be manyfold cheaper than the slow or no transition. And the faster the transition goes, the less it costs, because renewables get cheaper even sooner. Significant asset stranding can be largely or wholly avoided. And the standard assumption that a clean energy transition will cost more than business as usual thus turns out to be wrong. And it no longer depends on the assumed discount rate, as scholastic analysts have insisted for decades. So climate policy has spent decades focusing on supposed economic trade-offs that do not exist. The authors dryly conclude, I quote, updating expectations to better align with historical evidence could fundamentally change the debate about climate policy and dramatically accelerate progress to decarbonize energy systems around the world. The next and most critical stage of the academic debate will be trying to get policymakers to understand that the Oxford team is right because its work is empirically grounded while prevailing modeling is not. That shift won't be fast or easy. In Japan, it requires first that we take markets seriously, even if they temporarily inconvenience powerful incumbents. So we're not short of climate mitigation methods, we're short of deployment and discernment. Drowning in energy innovations, we cling to the familiar while overlooking many better solutions, probably totaling more than we will need or can afford. We're now entering the tricky phase of distinguishing useful and competitive innovations from pre-stranded assets. As our models improve and our vision clears, I suspect the standard projections of electricity, hydrogen, and investment needed to mitigate climate change may prove grossly exaggerated. And I hope Japan will finally shed the drag of old policies, adopt the full and fair competition that the law wisely requires, and celebrate as Japan's industrial might, technical skill, and social cohesion create a new energy revolution that can revive Japan's economic vitality, reassert Japanese climate leadership, and inspire the world. ご清聴誠にありがとうございます。
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Amory. As so often when I hear your lectures, I wonder if the interpreters manage to translate all the information you conveyed. And then I wonder if I and the others listening manage to absorb it. But the advantage of a hybrid conference like this is that you may go back and listen to Amory's lecture once or twice more, and then you might catch most of it.
And I will send it.
Thank you very much. And I hope that you can stay on. We will have 2 video messages now and then maybe a few minutes for discussion with Amory. But first we have a video message from Francesco La Camera, who is the director of the International Renewable Energy Agency located in Abu Dhabi. Francesco, on the screen, hopefully in a few seconds.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, let me begin by expressing my gratitude to the Renewable Energy Institute for inviting me to the Revision 2023 International Conference. This event marks an important reflecting point as we build collaborative and pragmatic action toward Japan's G7 presidency, toward COP28 and beyond. As we have experienced over the past few years, the energy sector, and subsequently economies, have been hit hard by COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical instability, and energy security challenges. We believe that the energy transition is the only solution that can address this complex crisis. And the beauty is that every country can benefit. For this to happen, and to avoid future stranded fossil fuel assets, we need greater investment in energy transition technologies. Keeping the world on track for the 1.5 Celsius pathway will require annual investment of $5.7 trillion on average between 2021 and 2030. This according to IRENA's World Energy Transition Outlook 2022. Just last month, IRENA and the Climate Policy Initiative launched the Global Landscape of Renewable Energy Finance 2023. The report identified that in 2022, global investments in energy transition technologies reached $1.3 trillion, a record high, up 19% from 2021 investment levels and 50% from before the pandemic in 2019. Yet, the current pace of investment is not sufficient to achieve climate, energy access, and energy security objectives, along with other socio-economic development goals by 2030. Here, I wish to expand on 2 of our joint reports' key takeaways to remedy the investment gap. First, phasing out investment in fossil fuel assets, which should be coupled with the elimination of subsidies. This will ensure that the full cost of fossil fuels are reflected in their price, leveling the playing field with renewables and other energy transition-related technologies. Achieving the energy transition requires the redirection of $0.7 trillion per year from fossil fuels to energy transition-related technologies. However, it must be stressed that the phase-out of subsidies should be accompanied by a robust safety net to ensure adequate standard of living for vulnerable populations. Second, the reports find that investment in renewable energy have become further concentrated in specific technologies and uses. In 2020, solar PV alone attracted 43% of the total investment in renewables, followed by onshore wind at 35% and offshore wind at 12%. To best support the energy transition, more funds need to flow toward innovation, less mature technologies, and sectors beyond power. These include heating and cooling, transport, energy efficiency, and system integration. In this context, IRENA is working closely this year with the government of Japan on a G7 floating offshore wind outlook, as well as supporting the Japanese G7 presidency in the area of hydrogen. This outlook will identify global trend in floating offshore wind development, how to scale up deployment through a robust policy framework, and the best practice on how floating offshore wind and clean hydrogen production can be coupled. Importantly, this outlook will also identify floating offshore wind technology trends with the least environmental and livelihood impacts, particularly important for biodiversity and the fishing industry. IRENA will also continue to leverage its expertise, along with its partners, through the collaborative framework on offshore wind, as well as the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, the GOWA, of which Japan is a member, to further highlight the immense opportunities offshore wind can play in the energy transition. GOWA has the ambition to create a global driving force for the uptake of offshore wind through political mobilization and the creation of a global community of practice. The aim of GOWA is to reach a minimum global offshore wind capacity of 380 gigawatts by 2030, with 30 gigawatts average each year across the 2020s, and a minimum of 70 gigawatts each year from the 2030. Regarding hydrogen, our collaborative report will include analysis on the production of hydrogen in countries where water is scarce, hydrogen carrier, and how hydrogen will contribute to improving energy access, amongst others. In addition, we must also address the critical materials required for these technologies to ensure energy security and prosperity for all. IRENA has been exploring how to address gaps in our collective knowledge and capabilities by using our global networks. We launched the collaborative framework on critical materials. I would also like to highlight an important collaboration between collaborative framework on critical materials and geopolitics on the analysis of supply chain transparency and market stability measures. IRENA is also collaborating with the G7 Japanese presidency to enhance understanding of the risk of critical material supply chains and ways to address them. We look forward to collaborating and building on these three work streams: floating offshore wind, hydrogen, and critical material toward G7 and toward COP28. IRENA is committed to collaborate with all our 160 members and 16 in accession process to ensure that COP28 is a COP of unity, a COP of action, a COP for all, and that the energy transition is achievable, equitable, and just. I hope today's conference will trigger further the global action for all. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. We're grateful to Francesco La Camera for giving this contribution, and it is good to hear that the collaboration between IRENA and the Japanese government in these areas of floating wind and hydrogen and critical materials is going. Regarding critical materials, I could refer you to a recent column I contributed to the Renewable Energy Institute website, explaining the difference between being dependent on material imports on the one hand and fuel imports on the other. Now we will have a final video message from Patrick Greichen, who is State Secretary for Energy in Germany and who has been extremely busy during the last year and a half to manage the replacement of Russian fuels at the same time as Germany has contributed to relieve the French of their electricity shortage and the Alpine countries who have lost hydropower. Patrick, on the screen in a few seconds, I hope.
Dear Mr. La Camera, dear Mr. Kohlberger, dear Mr. Lovins, the Russian war of aggression against the Ukraine and its consequences for the global energy markets have shown us in a devastating way, once again, that our dependency on fossil fuels must end. It must end as soon as possible. We're not only facing clear economic risks and these economic consequences that we're currently seeing, it also jeopardizes our energy security and our climate goals. It is therefore clear that Germany stays committed to phasing out fossil fuels, to accelerate the energy transition, and to stay on track with our Paris Agreement and the 1.5 target. We in Germany have declared to become climate neutral by 2045, and it stays like that. We will end coal-fired power production by 2030, and we're aiming at 80% renewables in our electricity mix until 2030. To achieve this, we're now implementing several measures. We have included a law that 2% of our land area will be dedicated for wind onshore power. We are planning for 200 gigawatts of solar PV by 2030. We are planning for 70 gigawatts of wind offshore by 2045 and more than 100 gigawatts of wind onshore by 2030. We're convinced that in the medium to long run, this massive expansion of renewables and our efforts on energy savings are not only the effective instruments to achieve climate neutrality, but also it makes us more resilient against energy price shocks. It makes us more resilient against any geopolitical turmoil that might come in the future. Therefore, we have, over the past months, worked hard to further accelerate Germany's sustainable energy transition. We have passed several pieces of legislation, an ambitious reform of our Renewable Energy Act, and a lot of these things that we have been doing last year have now entered into effect January, February in 2023. So this means we will now see a huge increase in renewable projects this year. Already in 2022, we had almost half of our electricity consumption being produced by renewables. This is now the basis on which we are smoothly accelerating our renewables, but also our grids plans to get by 2030 the 80% renewables target. For this, the speed of permitting, of planning, of approval procedures needs to be significantly increased. Therefore, we are now working so that the bureaucracy, that everything that is with planning and permitting of renewables is cut by half so that we are faster than we were before. We've established by law that renewables are now in the overriding public interest and that they serve public security, which means that they are now, when it comes to permitting, more important than other projects. We are at the same time improving our energy efficiency and our renewable heat policy, so that we're planning that every new boiler, every new heating installation to be installed as of next year will have to have 65% renewable share. In practice, this will mean a lot of heat pumps coming to our homes. For this purpose, we have expanded and redesigned our subsidy programs for the building, for the industrial, for the heat sector, and also to have more municipal heat planning so that we get clean heat systems, clean heat pipelines in our cities. So what you can see is that our short-term measures last year to increase coal was just a very short-term measure. That will end by the end of 2023. It was necessary to shield ourselves against the consequences of the energy price crisis caused by Putin. The same applies to our prolongation of nuclear power plants, which will go until April this year. But both will end. Nuclear will finally end in Germany by April 15 this year, and the coal phase-out will become back on track in 2024. So it is all about the energy transition. But this will mean that we also need to look at green hydrogen, which will be one of those energy imports that we will still have in the future. So we are going to ramp up the production of green hydrogen in Germany, but also the import structure, the use and the rollout of a global green hydrogen market. We are supporting this by establishing supply chains within Europe, but also globally with our H2 Global program, where we have now 3.6 billion euros for future auctions to get hydrogen, but also hydrogen derivatives from abroad to Germany. The first auction was starting last year in December. First deliveries of hydrogen derivatives are already expected by 2025. We will be further cooperating with our international partners because production, transport, regulatory framework, all this is necessary for hydrogen in order to get a global green hydrogen market. Those activities were also underlined last year in the context of the G7. Germany, having the G7 presidency last year, put climate protection and energy transition in the focus. The G7 has committed themselves to a predominantly decarbonizing electricity power system by 2035 and to put an end on coal-fired power generation, because this is necessary in order to have a clean climate. Further, we have established an open and cooperative international climate club. This is important to achieve decarbonized industry, where we need a format of cooperation so that international competition in heavy industries is going into a productive, climate-neutral way. This year, Japan took over the G7 presidency from Germany. We are now working closely together, Japan and Germany, in the G7 to accelerate the global energy transition to scale up investments. In my view, energy efficiency and energy savings need to be, again, a focus topic of the G7. Demand-side measures in key sectors like building, heating, industry, they have a significant potential to improve energy security and at the same time reduce emissions. Within the framework of the Japanese-German Energy Partnership, Japan and Germany have been working very closely together to accelerate the energy transition. Last week, we had the third meeting of the Hydrogen Working Group in Berlin, as well as there's a Japanese-German expert workshop on waste heat within the framework of our partnership. The partnership is an excellent example of a successful international cooperation. We, Germany and Japan, as large economies, as technology leaders, we have the potential to join forces, to become role models, and to advance the global energy transition through our cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, accelerating the energy transition towards renewables is the way forward for a stable energy security and to overcome the current energy and climate crisis. By joining our efforts, we can build a cleaner, a greener, and a more successful future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick Reichen, for this presentation and for the collaboration with the Japanese government during the G7 process. If you look back at this presentation, I suggest focus on the numbers he gave for the German ambitions. Germany is a densely populated, highly industrialized country, and their ambitions regarding onshore wind, for example, could be compared to the Japanese setting, which is also a fairly densely populated country, but with even better resources when it comes to wind and solar than Germany has. Now, back to Amory for one question. We are a little late, but there is one issue I would like to bring up with you, Amory. When you showed the scenario for Texas and the way you could balance the electricity grid, unlike some of the other scenario builders in this sector, you did not assume that you would overinvest in solar and wind so that you could cover the primary electricity use almost every minute, but also produce a lot of hydrogen and other electrofuels for other sectors. Do you think that this is still the way you would build a system that you suggested, or do you think these electrofuel scenarios maybe have become more economically viable than when you did your study?
Well, in that hourly simulation I showed, I was just trying to show how all the moving parts fit together to keep the lights on as solar and wind vary predictably over time. I was not trying to look at the whole economy, but there is an important need for clarity here, because people who worry about grid reliability tend to say we need a lot of excess solar and wind capacity to deal with bad weather conditions, and those were included in my Texas example. And then there's another group of people who say we need a lot of green hydrogen to make steel and cement and chemicals and so on. And they don't notice that they're talking about the same power supply, because what you build in excess, and you can afford to because it's cheap, to make sure that the grid remains stable in bad weather, is the rest of the time available to make hydrogen and ammonia to decarbonize heavy industry and transport.
Right.
It's not two different sets of electricity to make hydrogen. It's the same assets used for both purposes at different times. So I think many models don't properly reflect this duplication. They're double counting a lot of the costs. And at the same time, we are finding that by efficient use of materials and better processes, we can avoid quite a lot of the green hydrogen production that even a year ago was thought to be essential.
And that would mean that with that kind of domestic overinvestment in electricity generation and the opportunity of producing electrofuels domestically, that becomes more competitive with the concepts of importing electrofuels from other countries.
It does, but remember also that the solar and wind at world prices are now very inexpensive, under 2, often under 1 US cent per kilowatt hour, and certainly under 3, but generally falling costs. Some are already at or below 1 cent. And that makes very cheap hydrogen. So it's, you may find that the domestic production without the costs of importing a hard-to-move fuel like hydrogen may be quite worthwhile, especially in a country with such immense richness of renewable resources as Japan. It has more renewable options than any other OECD country except Chile.
No. Okay, thank you very much, Amory. We will now go on to the next part of this first session, and it will give a lot of information about offshore wind, a topic that is highly on the agenda for Japan and one where a lot of progress has been made in other parts of the world recently. Thank you, Amory. Goodbye.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for waiting as we prepare for the stage. Thank you.
Thank you for waiting. Could I ask for the moderators and panelists to make your way towards the stage? And could I ask the speakers to come up onto the stage? Thank you for waiting. We'd like to resume the program. Session 1 is on energy security and renewable energy transition. The moderator for this session is Ms. Hiroko Kuniya, a journalist. So Ms. Kuniya, over to you. Hello everyone, good morning. My name is Hiroko Kuniya, and I'll be the moderator for this session. And Mr. Kovirier has talked about the energy crisis caused by the invasion into Ukraine and the lessons learned in Europe. And from Dr. Robinson talked about various energy saving or innovative or technology translation possibilities that was energy transition, and Germany's very ambitious strategy towards renewable energy transition. So we are definitely seeing a significant shift taking place, and that was certainly clear from the message. So the invasion into Ukraine has caused the energy crisis, and this has created a certain a trend. IEA last year in December issued the next 5 years report for renewable energy, and said the following. Russian invasion into Ukraine has caused an energy crisis, and as a consequence, the renewable energy has started to accelerate at unprecedented pace. US, China, India, Europe, these countries expected to increase much larger level of renewable energy. In fact, updated the forecast significantly vis-a-vis the past the assumption. So this is some major tidal change that we are seeing globally. But if we look at Japan, and given the energy crisis, energy security or stable supply, so the diversity inclusive of fossil fuels seems to be the focus, and revaluing fossil fuel or returning to fossil fuel. One could even obtain as such an impression. And so expansion towards renewable energy, we are not really feeling the rapid acceleration in that regard in Japan. Now, the renewable energy in Japan, if we look at the ratio in 2020 in comparison to the previous fiscal year, renewable energy increased only by 1.6%. In 2021, on a year-on-year basis, the increase was only 0.5%. Only 0.5%. And so investment into renewable energy seems not be making any progress. One could potentially end up with such an impression. Now, in this session 1, we're looking at the global initiative to accelerate the renewable energy, and what should Japan learn from that? We have 3 experts from Europe that we would like to certainly address this issue. Now, in regards to Europe, as was mentioned in the keynote speeches already, but the response by the EU has been very quick. So Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February. Only 2 weeks after that, on the 8th of March, EU has came up with a major policy to phase out dependency of energy from Russia. And on the 18th of May, only 3 months after the invasion, they have already come up with a specific measure, which is Repower EU plan. This Repower EU, specifically speaking, by the end of 2022, to stop importing coal and oil from Russia, and also to procure from elsewhere the 2/3 of the volume that it actually imports from Russia in regards to LNG, and by 2030 to completely phase out from dependency on Russia. Apart from that, there is enhancement of measures for energy saving and the renewable energy in the final consumption. By 2030, the target, which was 40%, has been increased to 45%. And also, from Germany, Mr. Greichen, the State Secretary, so they have enhanced their effort to introduce renewable energy, and of the 80% of energy consumption, renewable energy, and by 2035, to increase the ratio to close to 100%. So they have announced such a plan. And after the announcement of Repower EU, Mr. von der Leyen, Ms. von der Leyen, and the quicker the switch over to renewable energy, the better. The higher the energy efficiency that we are able to achieve, then we will truly be able to become more self-reliant. And she spoke of her thoughts in regards to this plan. And I'm sorry for speaking too long at the outset, but please allow me to introduce the panelists. So how are we going to realize these initiatives? And we'd like to speak with these 3 people in that regard. To my left is from Norway, Equinor, and is Mr. Steinar Velge, head of floating offshore wind. And he is the person responsible for expanding globally the floating offshore wind, and has worked in various areas like supply chain projects and business development, and was part of the member who worked on the world first the real scale of floating offshore wind, and he is also a director, a board, a member of the Hywind Scotland L&D, who operates this Hywind the project. And next to him is Mr. Peter Marksen from Denmark, and he is the Associated Activities Senior Director at EnergyNet, the state-owned Danish transmission and system operator. Associated Activities, which is an EnergyNet-related company. And he has been working on initiatives for integrating renewable energy on a green and a global green transition. So he's been engaged in activities to that end. And he has been involved in Norwegian, the energy sector for more than 20 years. And he has deep insights into electricity markets, energy system development. And last, is the expert in the energy, the competition law and environment. And Ms. Lotte Fouquet leads the Brussels office of the law firm Becker Birtner Held. And she is collaborating with various European institutions as an expert partner. And she's very much well-versed in the energy situation. So before we start with the session, I would like to ask for a presentation from each of the panelists. And so if I could ask Ms. Lotte Fouquet to start with the presentation, please.
Thank you so much, Yogi-san. I'm very pleased to be here, and it's not my first time, since I'm also having the honor to be on the executive board of the Renewable Energy Institute since day one. So, and it's, as Thomas said before, it's so good to be back in person for once after all these years. I will talk a little bit about the legal pathway towards transition in Europe in view of the current situation, because without a good legal background, you have not planning security or investment security in the energy transition. I will skip a lot of the slides. You can read them later, because for the sake of our exchange, I should shorten it, but I will focus on what's at the moment on the table, which could be of interest for Japan when it comes to the legal debate in Europe. So I go immediately to the key decisions. We started, it's already history, in 2015 when we had the Paris Agreement, and we found out in Europe that the targets and objectives we had put ourselves in front were not sufficient to reach or to contain the climate change. And so we came up, especially 2019, with the European Green Deal, which opened the new Commission's agenda under Madame von der Leyen. And then we got, as all over the world, we are also part of the COVID epidemic and how to work with that. And we, again, in Europe thought we have still further to accelerate our Green Deal implementation, meaning we had to review even more progressively our current established legal framework and adjust it. And then in 2022, so only last year, Putin invaded parts of the Ukraine and started a bloody war, which, as has been said so often this morning already, has put pressure on Europe, put pressure on my state, Germany, especially to get rid of the dependence from Russian oil and gas. And so Europe overall decided to get rid of that dependence, and that created the situation we are now in, also on the legal level. I may say we missed one point in our stance against Russia and its aggression, and that's the nuclear ore supply, which has so far not been ended, and I think that's a very sad story. So we are not telling the whole truth on dependency here. So, and then I will come to one of the cornerstones, which I think can be very interesting also for your planning world in Japan, and that is how to accelerate the planning and permitting procedures. As I said, we have this overall goal, and we do have chosen a mixture of short, mid, and long-term measures, which we are at the moment already setting into reality or at the last stage of discussion between the European Parliament, the Council, and the European Commission. And that is the situation, the review on the energy prices, and the help to the final consumers and industry to cope with what happened last year, and the diversification, short and medium term, of gas supplies, and then most prominently renewable energy and energy efficiency. And it cannot be underlined enough how much has changed already during the last month. We will come back to that in discussion, so that especially Germany has managed to increase the renewable uptake in the overall energy consumption, not electricity only, from 41% in 2021 to apparently 47% in 2022. So we have a lot of measures, and there's adapted while I'm speaking in a way. We have, for example, a regulation also giving the right to member states to have peaks, ceilings on the price, so price caps for electricity and gas prices, which led to legislation in the member states. And we also have an easement on state aid control rules in the European Union to help to cope with many things. And then, as has been already said by Hiroko-san, we have the Repower EU as response, and there I have put a lot of things which we are doing now, and under Repower EU we do have regulations, also regulations by the European Commission, such as guidelines or delegated acts on green hydrogen, which had been before very disputed already under the delegated act on green taxonomy, but I don't go into that now. I will come to the enhancement of permitting, and before I hand over to my colleagues, we faced a lot of, and it had been on our agenda since years, the recognition that it takes too long to plan a wind park, or to plan a bigger solar field, or to ease access of citizens to renewable energies. So what we do now, for example, is we encourage member states to designate go-to areas. So to put it more positively, to say where you really should and can go, and make that clear. And that is now at the moment for wind and solar PV. Other renewable energies are also trying to be part of this go-to area, and it's still under discussion. We do have a very interesting spatial planning, and in race-to-go areas, we do have very short time for completeness check of application of only 2 weeks. And outside the go-to areas, also only 1 month. And we do have a total duration of planning and permitting of maximum 1 year, and outside the go-to areas of maximum 2 years. That's a revolution. And that, I think, will be echoed much more in detail by my colleagues from the industry. And the reason why we do it, or the legal background, is a recognition that you have to foster renewables and efficiency as an overriding public interest objective. And this is a very, very strong legal term, which we are now using. And it's almost the contrary. When we identify the overriding public interest in a given project, somebody is against, he has to prove it, and not the planner has to prove that he does a good work. So that's bringing a lot of momentum. So that's why we have also a special council regulation, which is also normally not the way we do law in Europe. The way we do law in Europe is in all parts of the world. You have the parliament, you have and the government, so in this case the council, to decide, and it's the commission who puts forward a proposal. But in our treaty we do have a special provision for emergency situations. We never used it for war, but we use it now in times of war, which is a very bitter thing, allowing the council, so the governments, to come up with specific, timely, constrained regulations. And one is this emergency regulation, as we call it, and that has established this overriding principal criteria, which, as at this time, will also be included in our normal regulation, so the Renewable Energy Directive especially. And that means, in my career of over 30 years with European law on renewables and efficiency and all these things and climate-related things, the first time I'm seeing that we do not have only one amendment proposal for the Renewable Energy Directive, we have two. So we wanted to go from RED 2, which is our current piece, to RED 3, but we are in parallel already discussing RED 4, which will focus on this permitting procedures acceleration especially. So I will not go for the sake of time in details, but you can read it later. And my last slide is just that it's just not stopping there. This will be still a very dynamic year to come. We do face a revision of the electricity market design. There is a gas market package revision. We try to have a better investment accelerator. And then there is France, with its failure to provide its citizens with enough electricity due to drought and due to old nuclear power plant situations, which will make it this year again very, very crucial to export a lot of electricity to France. And France has now a new renewable energy law, and I hope they can leapfrog like Finland and others to become exporter, but then of green electricity. Thank you.
福家さん、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Fouquet. There are many things that I wanted to ask a question about immediately. Various schemes to accelerate investment towards renewable energy. It seems that a lot of regulation has been established as well, but we'll come back to that later. Next, I would like to ask Mr. Maxson to present. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here at this Revision 2030 conference. It's a pleasure to be here in Japan. I went last year to learn more about especially offshore wind in Japan, and glad to be back here again, and to also then give some of our experience from Europe to all of you. So I will take on from where Dorte left, going into some details from a transmission system operator view. We have the responsibility for both the electricity and the gas transmission grid in Denmark, and for the daily operation, where we look at the security of supply being as high as possible, normally around 100%. My focus here will be on the operations, and especially the markets, because without the markets it will be very difficult for us to integrate the very large volumes of renewable electricity that will be built in the coming decades in Europe. So, but first, when we look at some of the numbers, and you can say to the left is again some of the same treaties and plans made by the EU on the Green Deal and Repower EU. And what we look at is a decrease in demand as well. It's energy efficiency. It was also mentioned earlier this morning. It is first priority is energy efficiency. It is the most effective way of reducing CO2 and reducing energy dependency. That is by not using energy. We look at electrification, where we expect more than doubling in demand for electricity. We look at renewables that will increase up to 5 times compared to what we see today towards 2050. And if we look at the Green Deal, it is driven by grants, 60 billion euro. It might sound as a high number, but also if we then look at the US with their Inflation Reduction Act, this is actually just 1/4 of what they're looking at in the US. So just to say that we might be in a hurry in Europe, but the US is also now really moving on. And when we look at Repower Europe, where we accelerate this Green Deal, we are moving on with more ambitious 2030 targets. So it's not just about 2050. Now it is also really to move on the short term or in this decade. And if you look at the figure to the right, you can really see what kind of transmission we are looking at. And this is one scenario from the Organization of Transmission System Operators in Europe. We have made 2 scenarios based on the European ambitions, where we will move on from around 20% green energy today to up to almost 100%. And it will be phase out of coal. It is less nuclear, still some nuclear. So yes, there will probably be some carbon capture and storage and utilization, but it is really the renewables that is driving our green transition in Europe. And getting back to the opening remarks from Thomas Koberger, just to show how electricity prices have developed in Europe. And of course, it's been started by the war in Ukraine with tight gas supplies, but it had also been a very low nuclear production, low hydro output, and very high demand. So there's a lot of factors that has influenced the price. So this is not just a gas supply shortage. It is a number of things that has happened here in 2020, 21, 22. And this has brought on a lot of discussion in Europe on the electricity market. Are the markets really working? And the main conclusion from ACER, that's the European regulator for the energy markets in Europe, they have made a very large analysis on, does the market really works? And they say, yes, the market, they do work. They have made sure that we actually got through this crisis in the cheapest way. The prices or the costs for Europe would have been even higher if we had not had efficient markets where we could make sure that it was always the cheapest unit that was producing the electricity in Europe, that we could make sure that the gas were flowing where there was the highest motivation to use the gas. So the market, they really work. But of course, you can say it's the supply of energy that has been the challenge, that suddenly we were not able to get the gas. And it was the situation with very warm weather, it was the situation on nuclear. But the market works, and they have saved us in Europe for billions. But of course, this has an effect on consumers, and it really has been a challenge for a number of consumers in Europe to actually pay their electricity bills. So something needed to be done. And one thing was to really have focus on reducing the use of electricity and gas. And it shows that we have reduced the use of energy or gas and electricity up with 20%. So that has been very important. And then to be able to support consumers, some of the windfall profits that we have seen in Europe have then been collected and will then be returned to consumers. and also what we call a solidarity contribution from the fossil energy sector in Europe will also be used to finance some of the support for consumers. But when you then look at the EU long-term electricity market reform, then it looks at the decoupling of electricity and gas prices, and also to make it future-proof for net zero. And our recommendations here is that now really be careful, because we should not solve the current situation with the long-term market reform. What is important is to have a market reform that can make sure that we have an efficient market towards 2030 and 2050. And our recommendations here is to look at have more local price signals. You can say today in Japan, you have each your region have your own price. It's the same in Europe. Each country have their own price. We have more price areas in the Nordic, but try to have more local price signals to solve the grid adequacy question, so that you locate where the price is low, instead of having a lot of new consumption where the load is high and the price already is high. It's about sector coupling, where you look at to combine gas, electricity, transport, heating, so that you can use it efficiently, maybe some storage as well. It's about strategic reserves, because in this transition, suddenly you may not have money, or you will not be in the money if you have a thermal power plant, but you might need it sometimes here in the transition. So you need some kind of strategic reserve set up so you can have a smooth transition. And then finally, digital solutions. This will be a very complex system. As you saw by Emery, he showed the Denmark how we have developed from around 12 large thermal power plants to now more than 100,000 of small units from solar and wind. And to be able to operate that system, to make sure we have security of supply, we need digital solutions. And I know Japan have very good skills in this way, so here you also really have a possibility to find the new solutions for the whole world. So, but as a system operator, we also say no transition without grid. And my point here is that don't just look at the electricity grid. Try to look at a holistic planning where you look both at the electricity and the gas and the hydrogen grid. How can you combine it? And in Europe, we have set up, there is set up a new organization looking at developing, for example, a hydrogen backbone, where we also try to use part of the existing gas grid, but also will build a new grid, because hydrogen will flow around Europe. And also maybe even we will produce hydrogen offshore, because the transport of electricity is relatively expensive to build new cables. But building a hydrogen pipeline is much more cheaper per unit energy, and might be a future solution. And it might not just be in 20 years, it might be something we will do maybe even in 5-10 years time. So it will come very fast. So finally, just to say thank you very much for listening. And from Denmark, we are trying to be in the front, try to develop the new solutions. We would like to share this knowledge with you. But on the other hand, as a small country, we are very depending also on others developing the technology solutions that we will need in Denmark to integrate offshore wind, to have hydrogen, to have the digital solutions. So we really hope that you in Japan will also take part in these technology solutions so that we can all benefit from it. So thank you for listening.
マークセンさん、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Maxon. So as we proceed towards the transition period, over a short-term and long-term perspective, how are we going to reform the market and the dispersed energy within the grid? And we need to look at things from a comprehensive way, not just electricity, but gas and also hydrogen. We need to use digital transformation and work on establishing those. There are many things I wanted to certainly, ask more about, but we'd like to proceed, and I would like to ask Mr. Belge to make a presentation as an expert in floating offshore wind.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and good to be here. Good to be in Japan. So I'll try to bridge the macro challenges on energy and renewables with our corporate strategy, and down to more practical, how do we actually do it in Equinor. So short introduction on Equinor. 50 years of experience, 50 years on oil and gas, main base in Stavanger, outside Norway. But for the last 20 years, we have started a transition towards becoming a broad energy company, meaning that we will transition our investments from oil and gas over to a variety of renewables. And offshore wind is, based on our knowledge from the offshore oil and gas, definitely one of our major investments. We are working both on bottom fixed and floating offshore wind, and floating offshore wind is definitely one of the reasons which we have an office in Japan, which is a very promising market for floating offshore wind. So, this is one too many. Where are we on floating offshore wind, and how can it become a competitive source of energy? We installed the first full-scale demonstration plant, or demo, in 2009, west of Norway. And then, some years later, we had the Hywind Scotland project in 2007 installed. And then we installed 5 turbines, showing that we can do not only one, but we can have a integration of 5 turbines to the grid connected in Peterhead, east in Scotland. So then we did the scale-up of technology, proving that technology was there. So the next step then was to, okay, how can we start reducing costs? So now, last year, we installed the Hywind Tampen project, west coast of Norway. That's not powering the grid, it's powering 2 oil and gas offshore facilities. But trends shows that going bigger, adding a little more scale, the cost starts to go down. So now we are at the stage where we are ready to go full scale, meaning 500 to 1,000 megawatts, or up to 2 gigawatts, which we are looking at in California, for instance. So the technology is there, and we are really ready to utilize that wherever it's feasible. So what does it take then to go from the technology travel to actually having a commercial market for this? It's definitely the transparency and effectiveness in the regulatory regime, which is both to timeline and volumes, because you need a line of sight for the whole industry, both the developers and the supply chain, to plan and to make it efficient. It's about scale, because you will need scale to reduce the cost. Big project will drive innovation in supply chains and so forth to reduce costs, but you will not get that before you have a big schedule or big scale. So that's where we are now, and that's kind of a tipping point. And then we have to, of course, continue the technology development, because it's about making fit-for-purpose solutions. Like you can see on this picture, we have 2 basically solutions, which is our preferred ones. One with a design which is only fit for Norway, actually, because we have the deep fjords where we can make the cylindrical spar buoy, and then we have the semi-sub, which we can utilize the rest of the world. That's on with the triangle. So technology will continue to develop, but that's been going on for a lot of years, and it has a lot of momentum. So I'm not worried about that at all. But of course, one thing which is a challenge in every new market is kind of the understanding of the environmental effects and the kind of facilitating for coexistence. So that's where I'll put most of my time today. And that's speaking about it's really about sustainability. And 2 topics within sustainability, which is of course key in offshore wind, is biodiversity and social responsibility. And we are targeting a net positive impact in our offshore wind farms. We do a lot of research, both prior to, during installation, and under operations. A lot of this involving cutting-edge technology, taking water examples within the wind farm, and using that to analyze the environmental DNA, so we can look what fish has been there. So it's a much more efficient way, and creates very little impact by doing those, utilizing these new technologies for analyzing how is this wind farm affecting the environment which is installed in. And of course, we share every data we can share within this topic, because it's a very important topic for the whole industry. And then it's on coexistence. We are working, of course, a lot with local stakeholders to develop a positive economic impact of our assets. And we have to have an open dialogue all the way from the start. And for instance, with fisheries, shipping industry, and so forth, we do that early on so that we can adjust the layout, for instance, on our wind farms. We have done that on more or less all our wind farms after talking with the fisheries. Where are they fishing? Can we move it a bit? Then it's better, and so forth. Can you make a shipping line through the wind farm? Yes, we can. So having those dialogues early is important so that we can share the space offshore. And also we are doing some very concrete measures on fishing together with Marine Scotland. We are testing fishing gear fishing within the wind farm. It's not possible with all kind of fishing gears, but currently we are testing out what can be used within the wind farm. So it's about using those assets we have to this is not something which the government has put on us, but we want to get as close as many as possible of the knowledge gaps which are there, because it is a new industry. So I've just finished off with a picture of, that's the latest wind farm from outside Norway, Hywind Tampen, and you can see the floating wind farm, and actually powering a floating oil and gas installation in the background. So that also shows how we have taken the oil and gas technology towards the renewables technology. Thank you.
ベルゲさんありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Velge, for your presentation. Now, as I said at the outset, when we are in Japan, the EU is diversifying the gas suppliers and delayed the phase-out timing of the coal-fired. So even for EU, I thought that the departure from fossil fuel may not be possible. And there are voices expressing that. But in Japan, we're not seeing the acceleration of the renewable energy transition. There is a thought that may be a slowness in EU. But having listened to the presentation, the introduction target has been adjusted upwards, and the new specific measures has been announced in a very short time in order to make this acceleration possible. But why is that possible? I'd like to ask Ms. Fuke, why in EU can you move so quickly to come up with the policies and to be able to raise the ambition and come up with specific measures? Why is that possible? What is the biggest background that enables this to be done?
Well, there are a lot of elements, I would say, and also I do not want to design a picture of Europe where everything is a paradise. We do have still a lot of obstacles. We have member states who are performing faster and member states who are not performing so well. And but everybody got a wake-up call, I think, due to that our targets would not help reaching the goal of Paris. That was one. And now the war. That may be the best instruments in my also retrospective, and we have it again, is to have strong targets. And now at the Renewable Energy Directive, we will have 45% renewable energies, again energies, by 2030. And that's a real good ambition. And also we have learned a lot. As Emery had said this morning, the technologies are there. The mistake Europe did, especially Germany, let its industry of renewables go away. So now we are trying also to re-industrialize Europe. There are also effects which would be good for labor. We do have also transition funds. As has already been said, we have transition funds for phasing out coal, so that people do not feel left behind in those regions where the coal, and we all over the world which have industry, we do have old industry, and that ground can be taken for other measures concerning renewables. We also think about it. I talked about the Renewable Energy Directive, but there is a lot around it. I said it. But for example, also we have a new directive on energy performance of buildings, which is also important. So to have coherence, you have a good planning preview, and you have to have these targets. And since the technologies are so cheap, who would invest now fresh money in anything else, I might ask. And also, as Peter just said, the grids, they are amazingly well coping, and Emory had said this morning. I'm also member of the supervisory board of the Austrian regulator, and they have the same problems with the gas as we have in Germany and other countries, but they're coping with it. And also, we cannot underline the fact that we have reduced the demand, as Peter has said, by over 20% in just some months.
他の方でなぜこう
Do we have others wanting to make a comment as to why we were able to come up with agreement in such an accelerated pace?
Yeah, I just want to add to you, Dorte, that the strong targets, because then you both as a system operator, then we can start planning on that. We can start preparing the grid, both the gas and electricity grid. But it's also for the developers, the owners of the solar and the wind. They can start changing their strategies, adapt their strategies to these targets. It's the supply chain. They can start expanding the manufacturing that is necessary to do this, because it takes time. So when you have your investment cycle in the energy sector, it's up to 20 years. So if you want to be somewhere in 2040, you have to start already now to change and adapt your investment cycle. And that is what we have seen in Europe, that we have companies like Equinor that is actually oil and gas, but they're really going green. We have Ørsted, that will be later today, really going green as well. So, but that's only something they can do if they can see 10, 20 years ahead with the strong targets. So it really is important.
1.5度目標を達成しようとすると
To achieve the 1.5 degree target, what do we need to backcast to? And we need to come up with a strong target for that. I think these were the comments. But in Japan, the 2030, the renewable energy, we have a target for 36 to 38%, but right now renewable is only about 30% right now. So the roadmap there, including the real vision or real plans, these are not all that visible at this point. That's the impression that I have. But to have a strong target, to come up with a high target, in general, I agree, but in details may not be in agreement. That tend to happen quite often in the world. But despite that, EU is trying to promote these processes strongly, like Fuke-san has said before, under the crisis situation. Overriding public interest, you've mentioned this, those people opposed, and when they are to oppose, they need to prove themselves. And that was a concept that has been embedded. I mean, I think you said that, and this is quite a new concept from my perspective, and it's one way of consensus building. This enables acceleration of our consensus building. Is this a new type of an initiative in that regard?
It's a new type, specifically defining around renewable energies. It's not a new principle. For example, I was very honored that I worked on this. I introduced that in the debate on the European level, in this principle, but not inventing it like this. We have it in the flora, fauna, habitat regulation, in the important bird areas regulations. We do have the strong protection, but then we do have the possibility out of public interest to do infrastructure, for example, even in an important bird area, to make it very strong. Unfortunately, in the past, flora, fauna, habitat and Natura 2000 regulations, the exceptions were always for highways, I would say. and less for wind parks. But we do had that, and we had already guidance documents in the past by the European Commission, how you can, for example, very concretely plan wind parks in Natura 2000 areas. And now we just, in order to accelerate, and in view that sometimes it takes, you know better, it takes 6 years for an onshore wind park, can take up to 6 years in Germany at least, which is, it is too long. Hello, we have 2023 now, and we have to reach our target to, for 45% in 2030. That's tomorrow. It's almost not possible. So that's why we said, so now is, we can later, I always say to my students also, maybe then in 10 years there will be maybe a wind park which will be taken out because there had been an aberration. But the principle has to go, we go for it now.
So we have this type of new rule being established for the renewable energy, and understanding of the citizens towards the consensus building, that there is a deep understanding towards the grand transition. But at the same time, in order to implement these policies, a large amount of funds are required. And in that regard, EU overall, in the terms of Japanese yen, the 210 billion euros are required. That's 27 trillion yen, and 15 trillion yen is to be spent for renewable energy. Now, Mr. Markson, the development of the transmission grid is going to be the key, but in Europe, the procuring of funds to develop the transmission network, who takes the responsibility for that, who actually raises those funds, particularly under the COVID environment. Many countries are strapped off the budget, and so raising of funds in that regard, how is it being worked on specifically? Because in Japan, the funds for transmission network is quite difficult to procure, but what is the situation in Europe?
Yes, you can see we have the existing setup we have in Europe for funding transmission between countries is very much financed through our electricity market. So when you have a price difference between Denmark and Norway, for example, then this price difference in electricity price can be used to finance new transmission between the country. So that is part of European regulation. So that is the way it happens for all countries, and we have then seen a quite large increase in transmission capacity between countries for the last 10 years, and expected to increase. So that is one thing, is the funding. Internally in a country, then it's up to each TSO to define what is needed to be developed, and we then need an approval, and then it is financed through the tariff. And of course we have seen tariff increases because there is a need for new investments, but also for reinvestments, but also to support, say, the whole system operation, because it is more expensive to run a system with much more renewables. So we have seen tariff increases. But on the other hand, we have also seen reduced electricity prices because renewables are cheap compared to oil and coal and gas. So all in all, when we look, not right now it's high electricity prices, but towards 2030, 40, we actually also expect to see a lower electricity price. But then also an important thing in our grid development is that we have the coordination between the European countries. We have this organization for all European TSO where we do a 10-year network development plan, where we then coordinate where is it the most beneficial new transmission to be built. And I know in the same way here in Japan, we have OCTO is working on the master plan, we have REE looking at this master plan, and so that you start not just looking at each region, but you do it for the whole of Japan, and make this master plan. And my advice here is then to do a master plan, not just for electricity, but also for gas and for hydrogen, and think about the whole infrastructure.
So the comprehensive the grid network plan is to be established. So in working on the planning, the brains for that, to plan the overall the situation, the key to doing that, and towards the transmission network to ensure investment is made in a timely way. What enables this? What becomes the key to enable this?
Well, so one thing is, again, it's in financing, as mentioned. It needs to be there. And also there, as part of the European treaties and the plans, there is also financing of, or partly financing of infrastructure. So, of course, financing is important. Then there is also the processes for approvals, especially if you are going through more countries or more water. You say, for example, in the North Sea, where we have built a connection now between Denmark and United Kingdom. It goes through German and Dutch water, so that's a quite complex. But then you have a European process where you can be a project of common interest. And then each country, they are obliged then to have a quite fast approval process. So that's also something that is helping. And then actually also one thing is that in our 10-year network development plan, also private companies can come up with suggestions for future interconnectors. So for example, Equinor think it would be good to have a new link between Norway and Denmark. They can propose that as well. So that's also a way to have an early dialogue with stakeholders on what are actually the necessary projects and with the potential investors. Where do they see there is a need for interconnectors? Because it's not just about environmental assessments, it's also about having stakeholder dialogue in general on what is it that is needed for security of supply, for electricity, for industry. There is really a lot of interest that needs to be handled here.
今回の EU の計画
The EU plan on this occasion, there is a high expectation towards offshore wind, I understand. Mr. Belgay, introduction of the offshore wind. It seems that Europe is on a little bit of a standstill right now, but the target for 2030 is 28 gigawatt right now to 135 gigawatt. So that's a significant increase in the target. So I wanted to ask one thing, expansion of offshore wind. What is driving that? Is it cost, or is it technology, or is it the procedure? In the case of Japan, the floating offshore wind is certainly an area of high expectation, but many things take so much time. And when you look at the government schedule, after 2030s, they will start the demonstration project for floating wind, and so social implementation is expected to take quite a long time, according to their plan. Now, Mr. Belgay, from your perspective, and you are working on various countries, well, how do you see the situation in Japan, and why in Europe are we seeing the acceleration of offshore wind? Could you respond to these few points, please?
Yeah. So there's, of course, a lot of things which have to be in place to accelerate offshore wind. I think ambitions and targets is good, but you have to back it with real projects, and there's also very often a timeline on this, and what we think it's not the time which will drive down the cost and make this as a commercial industry, it's the volume. So the faster you can build volume and take the hurdle of being early, the faster it will industrialize and become a competitive source of renewable energy.
So if that is the case, the reason why we are seeing acceleration in Europe is it's better to do it quickly. The cost, or is it the technology? What is actually driving the offshore wind? What is the biggest element that is driving the expansion of offshore wind right now in Europe? And in the case of Japan, the floating offshore wind in Japan, how do you view that?
I think what's driving it in Europe is definitely that we saw over 10-15 years, quite steep reduction in cost of energy for fixed wind. Floating wind is 10 to 15 years behind, technology-wise and industrializing-wise. But now we see as we will need to move to new areas. There are much more areas available for floating compared to bottom fixed in Europe from now on. So new markets are opening. We know that cost will come down. It has a great potential for standardization and utilizing then the knowledge from the offshore oil and gas, which has been floating to some extent, the fixed wind, and combining this into a new industry, making it to come down cost-wise approximately where we are on bottom fixed, and then you can apply it in a large volume internationally. So it's that's driving the floating offshore wind forward.
洋上風力についてのセッション。
So there is another session regarding the offshore wind later on. So we'll probably address that. We will address the Japanese situation at that session, but we are running out of time. We picked up on a very big theme. So to end with, I would like to ask each of you to comment on how we can accelerate the renewable energy in Japan. Despite the energy crisis, what is going to be the key to accelerate renewable energy in Japan? So if I could ask each of you to make concluding remarks on that, please.
I'm always a little bit embarrassed to advise another country what to do. That's in my German DNA after the other times. So I'm a little bit hesitant to say, but from our perspective, I can say what works well. I have set the targets, the programming, also how to overcome the missing money to get rid of the former champions in a face-keeping way. I alluded to transition coal in Europe. I personally would want that also to transition old nuclear in Europe, but that's my personal campaign. And also we have not touched upon what is also important and what also made Denmark success, for example, in other countries. You have to take the citizens with, you have to facilitate applications ready-made for the citizens to use, to encourage cooperative structures to source their own renewable energy, to improve their own efficiency status. That's for me in my practice as a lawyer, it's the backbone, especially for decentralized renewable energy, which is the beauty of renewable energy. So maybe that would be not an advice, but a remark.
はい、マークセンさんお願いします。
Mr. Marx?
And I think from my side, it's about seeing the possibilities. And of course, there is a possibility for Japan, but also look at the local, regional possibilities. On the west coast of Denmark, we have this town, Esbjerg. It's around 80,000 people. It was a fisher town, lived by fishermen and the industry from fishery. Then it moved on to be an oil town with the development of the oil and gas sector in the North Sea. That is now also declining. But now it's actually one of the most booming towns in north of Europe because of the green transition. It is the offshore hub of the North Sea where everybody wants to be, where they have the place and the size and the competences and the skills to develop the offshore sector in the North Sea, because we need a lot of renewables, and the resource we have in Denmark, that is wind. And you also have that in Japan. You have a lot of wind on the sea. You have a lot of sea. I think it's one of the countries in the world with the largest economic zone, sea economic zone. So look at these possibilities for the towns on the coast that can really boom in this, where you can get resources of energy, as electricity, as hydrogen, and try to see the vision also locally. So.
最後になりましたけど。
And lastly, Mr. Berge.
Thank you. I think from my side, it will be kind of, it's back to the line of sight on volumes and timelines for, not for targets and ambitions, but for real projects, because in the end, it's the real projects which drives the transition, and then you need to to go to large scale as fast as possible. Other things like the technology development and so forth, it's been done for a lot of years. We have come far and it will continue, but large scale projects is what you need to really accelerate.
So Europe is accelerating in terms of renewable energy transition, and we have received comments from various perspectives. It was only a short time, and so difficult to summarize, but I think it's important to come up with a clear target. And it's from these targets that we need to calculate back, work together to come up with plans, and also work on the regulation, address the finance issue, and to come up with many projects one after another. And these were things that we were able to learn through the discussion today. Thank you very much to all of the panelists.
Thank you very much to all the panelists, and particularly to Ms. Kuniya. This is the conclusion of session 1. We will have a break. On the ground floor and on the basement floor, there are eating places. Please enjoy your lunch and please return before we start the afternoon program. We will start from 1:30. Please take your belongings with you. Do not leave your belongings in this hall when you go for lunch. Please kindly refrain from eating or drinking in this hall. Please use the lobby or the foyer. Regarding the presentation materials, apart from some exceptions, in the recent time they will be uploaded on our site, and you are welcome to access the website. If you have filled in the questionnaire, please kindly hand it over to the staffs at the entrance. This is the conclusion of the morning program. See you later. Thank you.